So, 52nd Street. Famously, my brief appearance on Ken Burns's Jazz, for which I did a lot of off-screen work, and he was very pleasant to me. He called me his senior advisor. I had that credit. But on screen, you don't see much of me. But what you do hear me say was that when I first came to New York from Europe, you know, most people who come to New York, first they want to see the Empire State Building or the Statue of Liberty. I wanted to see 52nd Street, and it's true. So I made my way there pretty early on. I was only 17, but you know, very close to 18. So I was actually technically underage, but it didn't matter. So I was told by people that I, you know, met early on who were jazz people, that 52nd Street was no longer at its peak. But Lord Almighty, I mean, I can remember one time, and it was not unique, characteristic, Charlie Parker at the Three Deuces, in that famous band with Miles and Max, and you know, and opposite at Jimmy Ryan's, which was where I more or less hung out mostly, SIDNEY BECHET. So you know, before they famously got together at Paris, you know, at the Paris Festival, there they were, you know, opposite each other, and you know, you could hear the music. It wasn't by today's standards, it was rather inexpensive, but you could actually sneak, you know, listening to music without going into a club. Most of them, you could stand outside and, you know, you could hear quite a bit of the music, which was one way of, you know, saving money. Another way I learned tricks, like when you were at the bar, which I usually didn't sit at tables, I was usually by myself, and you ordered a beer, you know, you would keep the bottle, you know, you wouldn't pour everything in the glass and the bottle, because then the bottle is opaque, and then the bartender couldn't see how much you had left, so couldn't pressure you to have another quickly. And also I learned that if you had ordered your first drink and give the bartender a tip, he would leave you alone. Otherwise they would bother you, you know. But one of the really terrific experiences musically that I remember from 52nd Street was at Ryan's, and it was the band that Sidney had with, he didn't, most of the time when he was the leader, he didn't have a trumpet. He was competitive with his soprano, with the trumpet lead. He preferred to have a trombone. So in this case, he had Vic, and who had recorded with him, as we know. And so it was Vic and Sidney. Kansas Fields was the drummer. Kansas may not be a big name to people today. He was a wonderful drummer. You can hear how great he was on what I think certainly is one of Benny Goodman's best records. He appears under the pseudonym of Shoeless Joe Jackson with the Mel Powell band. Mel was in his band. He hired Mel when Mel was 18. Anyway, the world was waiting for the sunrise. A fabulous performance by Mel and by Benny, but it's Kansas on brushes, and he's beautiful. So he was there. I forget who the bass player was. The pianist was a very good piano player who was pretty much a regular there, but his name escapes me at the moment.
Kenny Kersey?
It wasn't Kenny Kersey. He's not as well known as that. He did record with Bechet, I think on Columbia, which was around the time.
Lloyd Phillips.
Huh?
Lloyd Phillips.
Yeah, that's it. That's it. And what happened was I was with a dear friend of mine who passed away recently, who is not a jazz name. He was, although he did some jazz things, his name was Alonzo Levister. He's probably best known for a Coltrane number that he composed. Coltrane Slow Blues something, and he was Mingus liked him, and he did an album for Debut. He did some music for a ballet by Donald McHale called Black Swan. But he fell between the stools. He was not a jazz guy, and he was not a conventional classical guy. So he wrote a couple of one-act operas that were very nice, never really got performed enough, but Gary Giddens, who is particular about what he likes and has very good taste, gave those two operas a very nice review in the Village Voice many years ago. But Lonnie eventually moved to Portugal, and that's where he died. He's older than me, so he lived to a respectable age. But he was one of the first African-American friends that I made through a girl that I'd met whose girlfriend was married to Lonnie. So lived in the Bronx at that time, and we used to get together once a week. Called ourselves the Kelly Street Intellectuals. We lived on Kelly Street. But I wanted Lonnie to get more into jazz. He had been at New England Conservatory. He was there at the same time as Jackie Byard. He knew Jackie. But you know, I wanted to expose him a little more to the kind of jazz that he wouldn't have heard much of, because this is, you know, the bebop era, and he was mostly exposed to that. So I took him to hear Sydney, and he responded to that. But then something happened, which I'll never forget, and that was, you know, clubs were open late in those days. The music could go sometimes, if there were people in the joint, and it could go until almost 4 o'clock in the morning. This was really late, but there weren't many people in the club anymore. And Sydney was in a mellow mood, and it felt like playing the blues. So actually, he pulled up a chair, he put his feet up on the chair, you know, and sit back. And they played the blues, they played a slow blues for the whole set. It was about 45 minutes. It's one of the most moving things I ever heard, you know, Sydney and Vic, and oh man, you know. And that really moved Lonnie, and he said, you know, that was the most meaningful to him jazz experience he'd had up to that point, which made me happy. And that was one of the most memorable moments. Ryan's is also where I met Dick Wellstood the first time, who was in Bob Wilbur's, you know, band, and with Johnny Glazell. Johnny Glazell, really nice trumpet player, who wound up being an official in Local 802. And Dick and I eventually became good friends. So that was the first time I met him. And Dick had a way of changing his hairdo, and sometimes he would have a mustache and sometimes he wouldn't. You never knew when you hadn't seen him in a long time. You wouldn't know exactly what he was going to look like. He was an absolutely amazing man, brilliant, and you know, he married a beautiful girl, gorgeous Flo, and they produced children rather rapidly. He had 4 daughters and 4 girls. He had to make money somehow. There wasn't enough in jazz, so he decided to go to law school, and he went to law school, did it in record time, and passed the bar first time, boom, like that. But he really disliked having to do law, and most of what he did as an individual lawyer was divorce cases and stuff like that. He wound up hanging his shingle in the bathroom. But from time to time, he would do work which didn't involve dealing with people, but legal work, paperwork. Teddy Charles, they both lived on City Island for a while, and Teddy got him some tax work and stuff that he would do, you know, to supply some extra income. But he, you know, is the only person I've ever known who corresponded in Latin with a friend. Went to Germany and picked up the language quite remarkably well, just like that. He was enormously well read. As I said, you know, he knew Latin, so he was into the classics. But again, you know, across the board, he was a great chess player. He and Don Ewell, who were very good friends, 2 pianists, they played correspondence chess, you know. There's so many things I could say about Dick. He was also an excellent cook. He had a limited repertoire, but whatever he made was great. He also had terrific knowledge and understanding of classical music, especially pianists. He had a not big but remarkable record collection. He introduced me to a number of pianists that I was not familiar with. He was a great writer. When I became an editor and had the opportunity, you know, to commission stuff, I tried to get him to write as much as possible. He did a few things for Downbeat. One was called, I guess it was called The Adventures of Selden Sideman. He did a column for a short-lived magazine called Sounds and Fury, which was edited by a character named Ralph Burton. A column was called After Such Knowledge. He was a brilliant writer. There is a pretty good biography of Dick, which I was involved in publishing in that series that the Institute of Jazz Studies did with Scarecrow Press. He and Kenny Davern became really close friends, and they were a great pair, quite different in temperament, musically beautifully compatible, and personally too. And they both lived side by side in New Jersey, in Manasquan, and I would visit there time to time. I had married recently my first wife, and Dick said, you know, he says, come to Manasquan and make children, you know. But we would talk about all kinds of things, and they had a job there in New Jersey on the ferry boat, which was owned. It was a beautifully restored ferry boat, which was anchored. It didn't go out on trips. It was anchored there, and it was owned by a restaurateur and trumpet player named George Morrow, who was a dreadful trumpet player. He had a very good sound, but he could not play a melody properly, though. He couldn't play in tune. Well, he was the band leader, and he had an excellent band. He had Dick, he had Kenny, had a very good drummer whose name escapes me. And when he wasn't playing, you know, it was a great band. A weird incident at the ferry boat. They made a couple of LPs on George's own label. George was a nice man. He was a nice guy. If he hadn't been, you know, they wouldn't have been able to stand working for him. And he treated them nicely. He paid them nicely. But you know, he was a horror to listen to. But a very dear colleague, George Hafer, whom when I started out, George was very nice to me, and then I had him at Downbeat, you know, and he did some great articles, done a lot of discographic work. George came to the ferry boat to listen to the band, and I wasn't there that night, but Dick told me about it. In order to get up to the bar there was a flight of stairs that you had to go up, and George had been there most of the evening, and I guess when the last set was over, he started walking down the stairs, and Dick saw this. He happened to be observing it, you know, so it said good night to George. He just collapsed on the stairs. He rolled down the stairs, wound up at the bottom, dead. A heart attack. So that was one of the less wonderful experiences. But what was so great about Kenny and Dick was that they both had wonderfully quick, you know, senses of humor that were somewhat different but well matched, and they both, Kenny also had a great interest in classical music. His main kick, Dick's was pianists, Kenny's was conductors. He was a huge fan of Wilhelm Furtwängler. Furtwängler was his favorite conductor. I had my maternal grandfather, who was a questionable person for various reasons, was a Danish composer and conductor named Paul von Klenau, and he was a good friend of Furtwängler's when they were both very young, and I had photos through my grandmother. I inherited a lot of that stuff of Klenau's, who among other things was the first to bring Schoenberg and his music to Denmark, so he gets credit for that. But after that, he divorced my grandmother, and he got involved with a Nazi woman, and he anyway, enough about him. But why did I bring him up? Oh, because of Furtwängler. So I had photos of Furtwängler as a young man, and I had a letter that Furtwängler wrote to my grandfather, postcard actually. So Kenny was so crazy about Furtwängler, and I really wasn't, so I gave him those things, and Kenny was I was almost embarrassed because he was so grateful. It really meant something to him. So that's an unusual aspect of, you know, a jazz musician being so. I went to record stores with Kenny a few times, and it was really a trip. And we listened to stuff together, and also with Dick. You know, Dick's death, which you know how that happened. He was engaged to play at a jazz party, and when the first set came up and he was supposed to be on the stand, he didn't show up, and it was Kenny who went up to his room and found him sitting at the desk, and he was dead. You know. There was a big blow. It was a big blow to all of us, but really to Kenny. I don't think Kenny ever really got over it because they were so close, and musically and personally. They do wonderful things together. For instance, they did an adaptation of Duke Ellington's Jubilee Stomp, which they called Fast as a Bastard because they played it up here. And they also did a piece called Kashmir and Togas, which is pronounced Kashmir Togas, you know. So they were a wonderful pair. They recorded together, of course, but another good friend who died on us much too soon, Dick Studhalter, who at the time ran some weekly jazz concerts at a nice little theater, had the two of them together, and he taped that, and it's a wonderful...
The Vineyard.
Yeah, at the Vineyard, that's right, that's right.